Appreciate it. My next guest was one of two people who was CEO of the Trump campaign at one point. He also served as White House chief strategist. He had a front row seat to the battle over Obamacare. He was interviewed by the Mueller team at least 3 times. Steve Bannon joins me now from Rome. Mr. Bannon, it's a pleasure to have you on. I want to get to Obamacare a little bit later on, but let's just start with what the Attorney General Barr, according to Chairman Nadler, not committing to releasing the full Mueller report. Do you think he should, except, of course, for classified material or grand jury proceedings?
Look, I think it's obviously up to the Attorney General. As somebody that was part of the process, I think they ought to release it, but it's the Attorney General's decision. You know, one of the things, Anderson, I think gets lost in all this is President Trump, waived executive privilege. He waived attorney-client privilege. He had, not just Reince Priebus and myself, but Don McGahn, the White House counsel, and others. I think it was like 500 witnesses, 2,800 subpoenas. So the president went out of his way to get all this information out and get it out quickly. So I would assume that everybody would want to get the full report out to people, except for what's classified or what needs to be redacted.
Yeah, and Lindsey Graham just said today that the president told him directly, said, quote, just release it. I know you thought it was legal but not wise for the president to fire Comey. Given the fact that Mueller has now exonerated the president and those around him when it comes to any kind of collusion or criminal conspiracy with Russia, was it smart in retrospect for the president to have been attacking the investigation in the way that he did really for the last 2 years?
Well, I actually used you as an example when we talked when I talked with the president back in the Oval Office. I said, hey, on the Comey investigation, I said, even Anderson Cooper, has got this in the C block. This is in the spring of 17. But the president had his own ideas about the job that Comey was doing, and so he terminated him. I always said that Mueller, I think, is an honorable guy. He's a combat veteran. He's a combat Marine. And the president, whatever he said on Twitter or whatever he said, in public declarations or on TV, the important thing was he told everybody to cooperate and to get it out there like no other president's ever done. That's what was stunning. In fact, I was kind of a critic about how quickly they were releasing information. I thought it ought to be a little bit more processed. There's 1.2 million documents that were released. So I think the president's actions, where he was fully supportive of the Mueller investigation, and that's why I think it's in coming back like it is to kind of exonerate him. I actually think it's time to release the documents and let's move on and get on with the work of the country.
You've been very clear about no collusion all along. You've been probably less definitive, I think it's fair to say, when it comes to obstruction of justice. Were you surprised that Mueller himself did not reach a conclusion or recommendation on that and essentially handed over to the Attorney General to make a conclusion?
Look, I'm not a lawyer, but the way I look at it, prosecutors either charge or they don't charge. The no exoneration line, to me, I thought was a little bit of a cheap shot. And I've been very supportive of the Mueller process. Here's the thing. They took 2 years. They looked at everything. It wasn't that I was concerned about obstruction of justice. I didn't think there was any. But, when you go through all these documents, and that's why the 2018 election, by the Democrats getting out there and working so hard, the grassroots Democrats winning the House, I said, look, what they're going to try to do is weaponize the Mueller report and to use that as the beginning under Jerry Nadler's Judiciary Committee to start kind of impeachment hearings and impeachment process. I actually think that what happened is with this report, it looks like that's all going to be put to bed. So we'll just have to see when it gets released. But I think it's really time to kind of release it, people review it, and then move on. And let's get on with the great work in front of us.
So, it's interesting. You believe even if there's, the report is released, even if it has negative, some things which are questionable behavior by the president or an attempt to, cover up what the Trump Tower meeting was with a sort of alternative explanation about it was about adoption. As long as it's not criminal, at this point, you think it's done. No matter what's released, it's really not going to matter. And no matter what Democrats try, in terms of, in your words, weaponizing, but in terms of investigating, it's not going to matter?
Yeah, I think, look, if there's anything substantive, Mueller had 20, serious professional prosecutors. They had 42 field agents in the FBI. I know as somebody who went through the process, Anderson, it was like a proctology exam. and I was a witness of fact, as was Don McGahn and was Reince Priebus. And so this was a very thorough investigation. I think if if Mueller had something, being the kind of senior level prosecutor he was, he would have done something. And I think by not doing anything and saying there was no collusion, which this whole thing started about, I just don't think there's going to be much there. Look, it's what, over 1,000 pages long. We'll have to see. I said, early on that if the Democrats won the House and the Mueller report, had these type of charges in there, had this type of stuff, that the Democrats are trying to, what I call, weaponize it and really use it to move forward. But I think you're seeing already in the House people like Nancy Pelosi saying, hey, we got to get focused on health care, we got to get focused on other things. So I think that this is a time to move on. I do think that the media ought to kind of assess both their coverage, and I've said this for a long time, both their coverage of the 2016 campaign and now their coverage of this whole investigative process. I think the media ought to be self-regulating and kind of internally look at itself, and then I think we just got to move on. There's so much in front of us with China and what's going on in the world. It's time to get focused on the big problems facing the country.
Yeah, and there's there's stuff going on with China, which I do want to talk to you about. In an interview, though, I think you gave earlier this week, you said that the president is going to, quote, or going to go full animal, which is an expression I hadn't really heard before, but it has really stuck in my mind. Now that he sees himself as no longer being under the cloud of the Mueller investigation, what does going full animal look like? What does that mean for, because I also know you said that 2019 will be the most vitriolic year in American politics since before the Civil War, and you include Vietnam in that. Both of those things are pretty startling statements. What's the vision for this year then?
Well, I was talking to a Spanish journalist, and I think I said honey badger, which, as you know, is one of my favorite phrases.
I love honey badger.
I think the president's going to be
honey
very
badger
aggressive.
Don't care.
Yeah, exactly. I think the president's going to be very aggressive. You saw some of the tweets. In fact, I was talking here to the Foreign Press Association in Rome, and the president tweeted out at the time his thing about the opposition party media. So I think the president's going to be very aggressive. I think he feels like the work of the country, particularly the work he had, was kind of slowed down, particularly when you look internationally, because of some of the hysteria around this investigation, not the investigation. And I think this is the thing that people should focus on. He overly supplied people with documents. He was very aggressive in getting this information out there because he said from day one there's no collusion. But I think about the hysteria that's what he's I think reasonably upset about. And I think you will definitely see some pushback. President Trump's a fighter. I don't need to tell you, Anderson, you know him very well. He's a fighter. And I think he looks at this as a fight. And I think he's going to be very aggressive. I think he's going to start giving interviews. And I think he's going to really try to push this. And look, we're just in a time, and I think democracy has never been stronger in America. We just had 113 million people vote in the midterm elections. I think we are divided, but I think division is good and healthy because people have to argue out and have to kind of fight at the ballot box for what they believe in. And I think the country is very engaged in this political process. I do think this year is going to be very vitriolic, and I think we're just going to have to work through this. But I think the President of the United States, and I think rightfully so, that Donald Trump's going to be very aggressive and kind of pushing back on this, what I think he believes was media hysteria around the investigation at the entire time that he was actually putting everybody in the White House, everybody on the campaign, front and center with all these documents and his lawyers that kind of work through this.
But I mean, listen, I understand the criticism of the media. I think every reporter I know is constantly trying to look inward and look at their coverage. And if something is wrong, apologize for it and correct it as quickly as possible. But at the same time, the president himself has, while he may have been behind the scenes, or the people at the White House may have been behind the scenes providing all the documents that they needed, publicly, he certainly gave a lot of people a lot of reasons to scratch their heads and think, wait a minute. I mean, from interviews he gave to tweets he sent to things he said to the Russians in the Oval Office. I mean, he did provide a lot of the questions. I mean, he certainly stoked it, whether he meant to or not.
Well, Anderson, I mean, but, Mueller had all this to go through. So I think he saw it. There's no collusion. And, if the atmosphere, I think the president justifiably looked at, and I've said this from day one, after the 2016 defeat, the Democratic Party was in such a disarray. The mainstream media was really the opposition party, as it had kind of been on the campaign. And I'm the one that came up with that term. And it was the opposition party media. I think instead of doing mea culpas or big inflections, internally, one of the things the media could do, and I think this is a big issue for both, conservative and liberal media, and this is the FBI's counterintelligence operation and some of the CIA what was done at the beginning of this investigation of the Trump campaign. I think it's really got to be looked into. And I've said now, Anderson, for over a year and a half, I believe something like the Church Commission is going to have to be established to look at the FBI's behavior in this and the CIA. And I would hope, in the old days in the 70s, the New York Times and the Washington Post would lead these investigations. That's not happening. Maybe CNN will do it, but I think there's a lot there. And this is not to get partisan. I think this is for the good of the country. We have to look at and I'm a huge supporter. I've never been a conspiracy theory guy. I'm a former naval officer. And my daughter's at West Point. I'm not a deep state guy. But we have some big problems. I think we have to, in a bipartisan way, look at what these investigations were, particularly look at the start of the Trump the investigation, the Trump thing, and I think really seriously question some of the FBI counterintelligence and some of the CIA and maybe even foreign intelligence services. And I think this is for the good of the country and for the good of the FBI and the CIA too, but I would hope that would be the next phase of investigations here.
As to the question of the vitriolic tone, which you mentioned, the president said recently something which I think a lot of people who don't like the president or distrust the president were very concerned about. He said before an audience, I can tell you I have the support of the police, the support of the military, the support of the bikers for Trump. I have the tough people, but they don't play it tough until they go to a certain point, and then it would be very bad, very bad. How do you interpret that?
I just think I think it's President Trump talking about the deplorables, talking about what his base is, which is, is a lot of veterans, a lot of people that have served the country, a lot of people in law enforcement. I don't think it's anything pejorative. I don't think it's anything to get people to get worried about. I think people read a lot more into some of the president's statements sometime in trying to read the tea leaves. I think this is all pretty straightforward, although I do think the president is going to be pretty aggressive in his tweets. I think in some of his interviews, I think the way maybe he talks to some of the people at Congress, I know he's not particularly happy with, I think, some of these investigations that may go into his, the finances or the Trump organization. I think his point is, hey, the American people had a chance to judge that in 2016. We voted on it, then we had this huge investigation into Russian collusion, which turned out to be, I think, honestly, kind of a hoax. And we've gone through 2 years of that. It's cost millions of dollars, but more importantly, it's the opportunity cost. Yeah. And now it's time to really get focused and kind of move on. And so I think he's very legitimate. I can tell you, Donald Trump's a fighter, and he's going to fight on this one. And so I just think it's time. And all these other investigations about his finances and all this stuff, I think the American people are eventually going to say, hey, look, you're grasping at straws here. If you don't like the guy, and I think Nancy Pelosi said this the other day, go beat him at the ballot box in 2020. If you think Orange Man bad, right, then get organized and get out there and do the kind of effort you did in 2018 and defeat him the way that you should, we have it in the United States.
Yeah.
If you want to win at the ballot box. Don't use some sort of investigative apparatus to do that.
I want to get your thoughts on the field of Democratic candidates and what's going to happen in 2020. We've got to get a quick break. If you would, just stick around. I know it's late in Rome, but I appreciate it. We'll be right back. Sure. Also, there's breaking news in the uproar. Back with Steve Bannon, former chief strategist of the Trump White House, former CEO of his 2016 campaign. So in terms of the 2020 election, how much of it, in your opinion, is about convincing people to switch sides or find new voters, and how much is about candidates just getting out their side, mobilization?
It's mobilization. I don't think we're in an age of persuasion. I mean, you want to persuade people on the margin, but I think it's mobilization. I think you saw that in 2016, where we were able to mobilize the deplorables, particularly in states that the Clinton campaign wasn't that focused on. They didn't think we'd win, places like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. I think 2018 election was the same thing. I think the progressive left did a terrific job, like the Tea Party did in the old days, of kind of grassroots, door to door. They mobilized their base, and they had a big victory. I think this is all about mobilization, and I think this next 4 or 5 months of what I call the gauntlet that the House of Representatives is going to try to think I put up around President Trump in these investigations. I think they look at that as one aspect of how to mobilize their base and how to excite them. So I think this is all going to be part of the lead up to 2020.
Do you include reaching out and finding people who haven't voted before? Because that's one of the arguments that someone, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a congresswoman, makes, which was in her district, reaching out to people who finding new voters and bringing them in.
Yeah, I think it's very important. It's low propensity voters. We did that in 2016. That's one of the things we did in 2016 that wasn't quite done in 2018 in these House races, was low propensity voters. I think one of the good news for all the Trump supporters is Brad Parscale in the campaign looks like they're very focused on already kind of doing that pick and shovel work that you have to do to build up this kind of this field operation, this digital operation, and actually get out there and do it. I know the Democrats are going to do it. Mike Bloomberg's talking about putting $500 million of his own money in to kind of anti-Trump. So I think this is going to be, look, I think our democracy, Anderson, is in the great shape because 113 million people voted. You know, the political discussion has permeated even popular culture. Everybody's talking about it. I think 2020 is going to be just huge. I think people will be very engaged, and I think it's about mobilizing the people that support you. And I think this is going to be very important, and I think the winner at the end of the day is going to be who mobilizes his base.
I think there are a lot of people who hear you say the democracy has never been stronger in America and would take huge issue with that, you know, I mean, look, this is a president who has undermined a number of institutions. You can argue they deserve to be undermined, but he's certainly, you know, he's questioned the FBI, he's questioned, U.S. intelligence, which obviously many people have over the years. But
Anderson, I don't think that's undermining. I actually think I think these institutions. Look, I believe in these institutions. I believe in the FBI, the CIA, some of the institutions in Washington D.C. But they have to be rejuvenated. And you always got to question. Remember back in the
the polls are fixed
in Vietnam with all those issues, all those issues, people were going after those all the time. And what happened? I think we made those institutions stronger. And I think that's one of the things. Remember, Trump was elected because working class Americans believed America was in decline, and the elites were comfortable with managed decline, and they weren't. Trump's a disruptor. I mean, he got hired by people that said, we want you to go in and shake up things. I mean, they had this cute phrase, kind of drain the swamp, but it's really quite serious. We want you to go in and we want you to start focusing on these institutions and making sure they're working for the American people. So I think undermine's way too tough a word. I think it's really Trump is he's a disruptor and he's trying to rejuvenate.
I understand the idea of disruption, but, he is siding with Vladimir Putin over, Dan Coates and others in the U.S. intelligence service about whether Russia was involved in the election. I mean, he stands next to Putin and says, he says very strongly that he didn't do it.
Anderson, here's the other thing. When you see this evidence, I think reasonable people can question about this whole thing of even interference. I think it's another thing to kind of question. And
you don't believe the Russians interfered in the election?
American people. Look, no, I think if it was, it's complete marginalia, complete total marginalia, right? I think there's another overhyped part of what I call the hoax.
So you don't believe they hacked
if
the
they had seen
emails?
Any kind of serious thing? I think, look, like I said, on the margin, I think you might have had, some emails. You might have had, these guys down in Florida that even Clapper said was $115,000 of Facebook ads. It's all marginalia, right? And look,
so
Russians
you don't
bad
think
guys.
the stealing of the emails was a major thing?
The stealing of the Podesta emails?
Yeah,
no, I think
DNC emails, Podesta emails.
Should you have done it? No, it's wrong to do it, but it's marginalia. It was inter-office gossip, right? So I think it was complete marginalia. I'm not saying it's a right to do, and we want to make sure we stop the Chinese, we stop the Russians, we stop other people from trying to hacking this, but I think at the end of the day it's total marginalia. And I don't think President Trump is trying to undermine any American institutions. I got to challenge you on that. I think what he's trying to do as a disruptor who was hired by working class people in the country to say, hey, we don't want America to be in decline, and we particularly don't want this permanent political class that's comfortable with managed decline in the United States. Remember, his task is to rejuvenate, and I think that's what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's a charitable interpretation, but I mean, just one more thing on that. I mean, meeting with Vladimir Putin without anybody else present, meeting with Kim Jong-un without just with interpreters. I understand disruption. Does it not concern you that you have no idea as an American citizen what was discussed?
Anderson, he's Commander-in-Chief of the United States military, right? He's a chief law enforcement officer. He's President of the United States. If he makes a decision that he wants to meet with a world leader with just interpreters or without interpreters, I wouldn't have problems with President Obama. I wouldn't have problems with Clinton or Reagan or anybody. If the President of the United States, in his judgment, is going to make that decision, I would abide by it. And I think people, if it was President Obama, I think Democrats would say it's fine. I don't think there's any nefarious activity. If he wants to make a decision that he wants to talk with an interpreter, I think that is, look, he was elected Commander-in-Chief. One of the big issues we had in the campaign when I stepped in is to give people permission to vote for him. as commander-in-chief, particularly given the resume of Hillary Clinton. People did. They weighed and measured Donald Trump in that campaign, and a hard-fought campaign, as you remember. They selected him, and I think you got to trust his judgment. And if you don't trust his judgment, you've got 2020. You can get out, you can knock on doors, you can say, hey, he's done all this bad stuff. Get your friends out there if you oppose him and beat him at the ballot box.
Is there one candidate on the Democratic side announce or expected to announce who you think would provide a real challenge to President Trump?
I don't really see a real challenge right now, and quite frankly, I'm a little surprised. I thought there might be some real challenges. I think the launches of these things have been particularly kind of weak. The one thing I think is very different in this primary season, Anderson, than any other we've had in American history, is that the sitting president, Donald Trump, is going to have a vote in the Democratic primary. That's a reality, and this is because of President Trump's House style, right? He's going to be engaged, and I think a perfect example is Elizabeth Warren. I think Elizabeth Warren probably got some of the more well thought through. Well, yes, she's got probably, if you look at it, particularly given some of the other candidates, she's got some pretty well-defined policy initiatives on big tech, on getting people more participation and ownership in society.
Which are actually things you have
I think she started
been
10 or 11%.
for a long time. I mean, there's sort of populist
listen, I think on the populist side, you have kind of right-wing populism and left-wing. I don't believe all her solutions. I think some of the stuff she's been saying is very smart. In fact, I kind of say, hey, she's lifting it from our playbook. But what's most amazing to me is she's now at 8%. And even President Trump said the other day, hey, maybe I moved too quickly. She would have been a weak candidate. I think it's very interesting, and I think it's his direct involvement has really brought Elizabeth Warren under 10%, and she's having a tough time getting that muzzle velocity, that traction you need to get going. So I think all the candidates, one of the things that surprised me the most is how much the AOC's kind of New Green Deal and kind of this movement to the far left economically has pulled the candidates, I think, farther left, and I think they've had some pretty slow starts. Right now, I don't see anybody, and I think when Joe Biden announces that's going to peak Biden, I don't see anybody in this field right now taking on Donald Trump. Donald Trump is going to be very tough in this campaign. He's going to go right at you.
And you see Hillary Clinton coming in?
You got to go right at him. Here's what I think. Secretary Clinton has said she's not running. But, she's in the bullpen waiting for the call. I believe that if you go through this gauntlet this summer, you start the Democratic primary. By the fall of next year, if there's not a candidate that's kind of breaking out of the pack and looks like they can take on Trump, because the number one thing for the Democrats is not policy right now. The number one thing for Democrats is beating Donald Trump. And they're going to fall in line with whoever they think can beat Donald Trump and shows they can beat him. If you get to the fall of 2019, Iowa, and you don't have a candidate that's breaking out, it looks like it matches up with Trump, I think somebody's going to call the bullpen and get her to start warming up, because she's there. She's going to say, hey, I get 63 million votes. Look, I realize people's heads will blow up, particularly Democrats that don't want anything to do with her. But remember, at the end of the day, the Democrats, I think, are going to focus on somebody who can beat Donald Trump, and they're going to search for that. It's not going to be a policy discussion. It's going to be electability. And if you're going to beat Donald Trump as an incumbent, you're going to have to bring it, right? You're going to really have to bring it. In the field I've seen so far, I don't know anybody that can hit a fastball like Donald Trump can throw.
Just lastly, you're in Rome tonight. You're focused there. You're there to focus on China. I've heard you talk about the China 2025 initiative. It's something I've been looking at. I find it fascinating. It's not gotten a lot of attention in the United States, but Chinese espionage, the stealing of trade secrets, recruiting Americans to steal information, it's become a huge issue for intelligence agencies, more than. I mean, I've talked to some intelligence officers who say it's more than Russia, more than anybody else. Is the U.S. on top of this enough?
Well, I think before Trump got there, we really weren't. Remember, Xi came to the Rose Garden a couple of years ago with President Obama and promised President Obama and actually signed some documents saying, hey, we're going to stop all this cyber theft. We're going to stop cyber espionage, and didn't. It was really Trump. And the reason we did it, that's why we think we won the upper Midwest, is because all these manufacturing jobs that the elites let go to China, that's what's, the jobs left, as J.D. Vance says, the jobs left in the opioid crisis came in with the workers that were left behind. This is a central issue to the United States. In Made in China 2025, Anderson, let me give you the bad news. It's not about the stealing of intellectual property. It's about forced technology transfers. This is what this very tough negotiation that Ambassador Lighthizer is having right now under President Trump's guidance on the trade deal. It's not about soybeans. It's about making major structural changes to the Chinese economy. what Made in China 2025 is, and every American should understand this because it will change your life, is the convergence of advanced chip design, artificial intelligence, and robotics. They have a plan which they've been working on for years and announced it that by 2025, the convergence of those three will make them an advanced manufacturing superpower and really will become kind of a component parts supplier for their manufacturing, high value added. That will crush manufacturing in the United States. It will lead to underemployment like you can't believe. This is going to be a massive issue in 2020. This economic war that China's been running against us, and one of the reasons I'm here in Italy, this One Belt, One Road initiative, the Italians, who are our allies, signed a memorandum of understanding. It's not a full deal, but to anchor the One Belt, One Road actually up near Venice on the Adriatic Sea. It's a major strategic shift, and I know that the United States is now engaged in talking to Italy, et cetera, but this geopolitical struggle, this economic war of China versus the West, and this is why the Russia thing I've said for years is kind of silly. Russia's economy is the size of New York State. China, and this is not the Chinese people. The Chinese people are as decent and hardworking, honorable people. This is this kind of radical cadre of the Chinese Communist Party that runs China, is an economic war and is an existential threat economically to the industrial democracies of the West. And this is, you're going to see this now play out on a global stage, and it's going to be a huge part of the 2020 campaign.
Yeah. Steve Bannon, appreciate talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anderson.
Still ahead with breaking news in